What is this? Welcome to Steel Creek Explorer. I'm your host, Jeremy Stout, and over the next 2 episodes, we're going to introduce you to some of the park's hidden history. Maybe we'll even find out what this thing is. Welcome back. As I mentioned, on this episode of The Explorer, we're going to dive into the park and we're going to dive into some of the records, some of the maps, some of the old historical documents, and we're going to take you on a quick tour of the human history of the last 10,000 or so years of Steel Creek Park. When you hike in Steel Creek Park today, it's easy to forget that there has been a record of human activity here stretching back a very long period of time. You hike our knobs and trails, the first thing you notice is how remote the park is. It's forests, it's woods, it's fields. You don't find a lot of structures and buildings and artifacts just right at the surface. But if you know how to look and if you know where to look, you find out that there have been a lot of folks here stretching back a very long history. So where does the history of human activity in Steel Creek Park begin? Well, with some of the very first Americans. Some of those first peoples that migrated to North America from Asia. They walked over the Bering Land Bridge in what is today Eastern Asia and Western North America, Alaska, the Bering Land Bridge. Those were peoples that were here as early as 12 to 14,000 years before present. We have a record of that Clovis culture from neighboring Southwest Virginia and some sites right here in Sullivan County. Even in Steel Creek Park, we have a point here which is not a perfect Clovis point, but it is a manufacture and an industry that would be consistent with that Paleo-Indian culture, maybe 10,000 years or so before present. These were the first Bristolians, indeed these were the first Americans, and they might have encountered somebody else living in Steel Creek Park when they arrived, the jaguar. It's the same species that we have that still lives in the world today, but at the end of the Ice Age, jaguars actually lived in the mountains here of East Tennessee. We have a record of them right here in this immediate area. This is an Appalachian jaguar that have since become locally extinct. This is also a great point to talk about the difference between archaeology and paleontology. Those are two sciences that a lot of people get confused, but they are very different sciences. Paleontology is one of my passions, and it deals with the study of prehistoric plants and animals. So dinosaurs, Ice Age jaguars, woolly mammoths, trilobites from the Cambrian period, those would all be objects for paleontologists to study. Archaeology is the study of human history. So Clovis points from 12,000 years ago. The later American Indians that called Steel Creek Park home, we'll talk about those in a few minutes. Those would all be examples of archaeology. The pyramids of Egypt, ancient Greece, archaeologists would study all of those. Sometimes the picture can get a little bit unclear. What if you have an archaeological point found inside of an extinct creature like a woolly mammoth? Things like that have happened. Well, that's when you have paleontology and archaeology occupying much of the same field. So sometimes those lines can get a little bit blurry. So anyway, back to the history of the park. So the first peoples in Steel Creek Park would have been of the Clovis culture and would have encountered a very different Steel Creek Park that we have today. Not only the Appalachian jaguar, they would have encountered mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths, even some saber-toothed cats among many other things. So these peoples lived a nomadic life. They probably lived in small family groups. They would have followed herds of prey from one location to another, not settling down in any one place for long. So they would have been mostly transient through our region, following food as it was available. The implements that they used were pretty crude. They were fairly simple points. They could be much larger than this. They were typically fitted to the ends of spears, and they also had a handful of cutters and scrapers and knives. Fairly a simple manufacture. They got the job done. These weren't farmers. These weren't agrarians. These were people following large creatures and hunting those and eating those and foraging a few wild herbs and vegetables that they could find along the way. But as of course we know, jaguars are no longer in our area. The mammoths and mastodons are gone. The saber-toothed cats are gone. The landscape changed, and so too did the people. The Paleo-Indian cultures gave way to the archaic cultures, which also then went on to become the subsequent woodland and Mississippian cultures, and we have records of those from Steel Creek Park as well. So we know those paleo peoples were in the region. We have some definite Clovis points from here in Sullivan County. And then we also have, maybe a Paleo-Indian point here from Steel Creek Park. What we have a very rich record of in this area and in the park is that of the woodland and Mississippian cultures. These were American Indian groups that lived across much of North America, primarily from about 1000 BC up until about 1000 AD. So starting about 3,000 years ago, and their culture waning and evolving into other cultures about 1,000 years ago. This is a culture that we find lots of their stone tools and implements behind. In fact, a lot of times here at the Nature Center, folks will bring in very much a projectile point, and they'll say, look, I found a Cherokee arrowhead. And I say, well, it's not Cherokee and it's not an arrowhead, but you have found an important artifact. The woodland and Mississippian cultures, these were some of the same peoples that were the famed mound builders. You find mounds in large mounds here in Tennessee, and some famous ones in Illinois and the Ohio Valley. But those cultures were right here. And in fact, I have some artifacts that were found in Bristol, and many of these were found right here in Steel Creek Park. This was a trove of projectile points. And what's interesting to point out is that all but the very smallest of these were probably not arrowheads. Some of these, anything that was probably this big or bigger, is more likely a spearhead. The arrowheads were very, very small. And right off the bat, you find that these are much more ornate, especially this one right here. These are a great deal more detailed than you find in those paleo cultures that came before. You also find a diverse array of instruments. So these points right off the bat, you can notice they are a good deal more intricate. They are a great deal more ornate than those simple archaic or paleo points that you would find before them. You also find a new diversity of stone tools. These were people that were still working in the Stone Age. They were making stone implements, but they had different tools for different jobs. You had very small points to be fitted at the end of a shaft for an arrowhead. You had points that were meant to be held in the hand to be used as a drill or an auger, or maybe even to prepare hides for sewing. You also find points that may have had a ceremonial use, in addition to just the practical use of being fitted at the end of a spear. And then you have a great deal of tools that were worked on a single side to be knife edges, skinning tools, in addition to tools for living. Of course, the agricultural revolution had occurred prior to this time. These weren't peoples that were moving through Steel Creek Park and Bristol. These were cultures that lived here. So in addition to making stone implements that are easy to preserve, they also had pretty expansive villages right here in our immediate area. So right here in Bristol, we have this beautiful mortar and pestle and this axe head that were found on, I believe on 5th Street right here in town. And all of these stone tools, not just indicative of hunting grounds, but indicative of life in a village that came from right here at Steel Creek Park. So one of the groups that you're probably very familiar with, or maybe you think you are, is of course the Cherokee and some of the other more modern tribes that occupied our area. By far, most of our American Indian heritage that we find regularly in this region are from those earlier woodland and Mississippian and archaic cultures. The Cherokee, of course, were here. And in fact, there's some intriguing research that's happening out of East Tennessee State University right now about finding out that they appeared to be more invested in this region than maybe we had once thought. However, that was a culture that was not as extensive here as those earlier tribes. And a lot of what they made was not out of stone. It was out of clay and bone products, things that did not stand the test of time as well as some of those earlier artifacts. But of course, the Cherokee do have a rich history in Steel Creek Park and in this region. We just don't have a lot of tangible artifacts from that history right from this region. And so then, of course, we move into the more modern history. What did folks do with what is now Steel Creek Park in the last 200 years? Of course, we know Bristol was founded in 1856. As we've talked about before, Steel Creek Park has a, shall we say, an unusual geology that didn't lend itself to being built up as much of Bristol was. It was left largely open, but it was logged at the turn of the 20th century. In fact, some of our hiking trails follow those 100-year-old logging roads. We'll see some of those here in a few minutes. Rock was quarried from several places in the park. We have evidence of some home sites and some structures that are well over 100 years old right here in Steel Creek Park. And then we have the human usage that immediately predates the park. The story of how the park even became a park is a really interesting story that deserves to be told. Learning about the different interests that were in the park and who owned, you know, right now we're a city park. We're the 3rd largest city park in the state of Tennessee. But parts of Steel Creek Park used to be owned by the state of Tennessee. Parts of Steel Creek Park used to be owned by the federal government. In fact, in just pre-World War II times, the United States Army used much of what we now call Slagle Hollow for drills, for war games that they would have out there. And we occasionally find artifacts from that part of the history as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get out into the park and let's see what evidence of the past 50, 100, 10,000 years we can find today.